Hey, we're your hosts.
I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Jonathan.
And we believe that one of the most valuable gifts you can give to yourself is the gift of wholeness through integrating all aspects of what it means to be human.
And in this podcast, we're bringing you insight, information, and inspiration to move from a stressful to stress-free life.
Your journey to becoming even healthier and happier starts right now.
Welcome to Wellness Theory, the podcast.
Hey everyone, today I'm so excited to introduce you to our next guest. Our guest today has been helping people improve their performance and quality of life for over a decade. And that's been as a coach, a trainer, and a speaker. His expertise stems from a background in biology, education, a current academic study of psychology, and lifelong personal experience of stress-related adversity, including depression, cancer, 2 catastrophic burnouts, and a chronic stress-related disability. He is currently working on his 3rd book and has dedicated his professional life to training leaders and teams around the world on how to manage stress effectively at both an individual and systemic level. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jay Unwin. How are you, my friend?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
You're most welcome. Great. I really love that intro. I think there's so many things in there that we can immediately unpack. But first of all, Jay, why have you dedicated your life to essentially stress and stress management?
That's not a small question, is it?
It's
Start
not.
with. Let's go.
Straight into the mix.
I think the biggest thing for me really has been personal experience, and it's been quite a journey. It's not something that I've that I decided early on and suddenly jumped into going, yeah, this is what I'm going to dedicate my life to. I initially, after university, went into teaching as my first career. I'd done biology at university, realized upon coming out of university that biologist isn't a vocation unless you go into kind of further research and do your master's, your PhD and so on. I realized I wasn't actually qualified to really do anything. And I thought, okay, I need to choose a career here. And I had a certain list of things that I wanted my career to fulfill, like a checklist. And it was things like, reasonable paycheck, an ability to continually learn and develop my own skills, a career progression, the feeling that I was doing something beneficial for society or my community. And teaching was one of the things which jumped out to me. And I thought, okay, this is something that I could go into and dedicate my life to. I say dedicate my life to because less than 2 years later, I burned out. And that was that first, you mentioned in the intro, I had 2 catastrophic burnouts. That was the first taste where I was just completely unable to work. I was manifesting all the symptoms of this overwhelm and this burnout physically. And because I have a rather checkered medical history, again, in the intro, you mentioned about cancer, I had lymphoma as a teenager. And so there's always this panic when I go and see doctors about some kind of symptom that there could be a relapse. And so I was going through all of these tests. It was constant blood tests and CT scans and x-rays and all of these things. And every time it would come back and they'd say, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, you're fine. And I was like, well, I'm clearly not fine, right? Because all of this stuff is happening. And eventually my GP said to me, have you considered it might be stress? And my immediate response was, well, I don't feel stressed. And he said, well, stress can actually show up physically with physical symptoms, not just, the feeling of psychological stress. So I started doing a bit of reading because I'm a massive nerd and I love reading around these things. And I started kind of delving into stress and teaching myself about it. And I was absolutely blown away by, all this stuff that I didn't know. And I realized, that he was absolutely right. And this was what it was. It was a burnout. It was too much stress, too much overwhelm. It was around the same time that I became a dad for the first time as well. My first daughter was born around the same time. So there was all of this stuff going on, not just professionally, but personally as well. I ended up leaving teaching and decided to go into an industry that would keep me fit and well instead. I thought health and fitness industry, right? I'll retrain as a personal trainer. I'll go into the health and fitness industry because everyone in the health and fitness industry is healthy and fit. And turns out that's not actually the case.
No.
No. And so it was a good decision for 5 years. I had a successful personal training business. I did some online coaching, did a lot of nutrition stuff, owned my own gym for a little while. But 5 years into it, I burned out again. And there was 6 months where I was completely unable to work, physically and mentally, just done. And in that 6 month period where I was trying to recover, I did a lot of reflection, and I realized that although I changed my external circumstances, I hadn't really changed my own values, my own behaviors. And to all intents and purposes, I'd gone from being a workaholic teacher to being a workaholic personal trainer. And I was still constantly trying to get everything perfect. There was always more I could be doing. And that perfectionism is really what finished me off. And off the back of that, that was 2017. So it's a little while ago now. And I realized that fitness, in the sense that I'd been doing it for 5 years, really had no bearing on everyday life if I couldn't deal with just regular stuff. What good was it? What good was the training in the gym if everyday life finished me off? And I developed a more holistic approach to fitness upon that realization, and this kind of idea that, well, no one can actually even define fitness for me. If I was surrounded by people who did fitness for a living, I asked them, what does it mean? Everyone has these ideas, but you can't really define it in a simple word or a simple sentence. And I realized upon that realization, it followed on to, well, fitness is your ability to cope with and recover from stress. So physical fitness is your ability to cope with and recover from physical stress, which could be going to the gym or running a marathon, those typical fitness type stuff. But it could be getting up and down the stairs, could be running around after your kids. It's your ability to do physical things and recover afterwards. That's what physical fitness is. And so mental fitness is your ability to cope with and recover from mental stress, emotional stress. And then when it becomes framed in that way, it has a huge impact on everyday life, your performance at work, your relationships, your ability to enjoy your hobbies. All comes back to your ability to cope with and recover from physical demands or mental and emotional demands. And that's kind of where this amalgamation of the fitness stuff and the stress stuff came from. And more recently, because individuals, when they want someone to help with their fitness, they don't want them to start talking about stress. They're just like, hey, give me a workout plan or a diet plan or something. What you want about talking about stress? And I decided that working with individuals wasn't the way to go for me, because it was too much of a hard sell. People didn't get it. So I started working with organizations and going in and speaking to teams about stress management and how they can make that accessible to anyone, how you can manage it at a systemic level as well as an individual level. And since then, I've started doing my master's in psychology as well, to really kind of consolidate all of that knowledge, because that's where stress sits, right? It's at that intersection of biology, so my past study, and psychology, my current study, because you've got the psychological element, you've also got the physiological stress response, and that ties in with all the personal experience I've had of it over the years as well. Which, let's be honest, we've all had it.
Exactly. Listen, that's such a great answer to that first question straight off the bat.
Sorry, it was so long.
Never apologize for that. It is all absolutely relevant, and particularly the way in which you've come into this. And there's actually quite a few similarities between kind of your journey around kind of being in that fitness piece, and then almost like seeing where does stress sit in that. Because we found that a very similar thing is that actually, when we was asked that question, why focus so much on stress, or why are you so passionate about stress? We're like, we're not actually passionate about stress. We're passionate about the vitality and everything that comes from stress relief, and how we manage that, and how we can grow our capacity and our resilience to be able to deal with stress, whether that be healthy or unhealthy kind of stress. And weaving that into day-to-day life when it comes to that health and fitness side, is that we realize everybody is experiencing stress on some level. They're just not necessarily identifying with. So I found it really interesting what you said when you went to the doctor, and the doctor said, have you considered it stress? You're like, but I don't feel stressed. That is so common. That is so common, and it's something that I still experience today. It'd be like, are you stressed out? Because I might be coming up with a bit of a block of something, or I'll be maybe a bit like less energized than I usually am. Somebody's like a friend of mine, like, are you stressed right now? Are you overwhelmed? I'm like, I don't feel like I am, but it really makes me stop and check, well, am I? And when I actually then look at maybe the demands and the things that are going on in my world, both external and internal, I can actually start to obviously pinpoint that and have a deeper sense of self-awareness. So just on that note, Jay, like, how can someone that's maybe listening to this start to resonate whether they're stressed or not, because we say something similar to what you said, is that it comes from many different places, it manifests differently. There's psychological stress, emotional stress, physical stress. How does somebody start to decipher perhaps what they're experiencing?
It's a process for sure, and it takes time, and it takes for me it took a lot of practice to develop that level of self-awareness. I think part of it comes from learning about how stress can manifest, and spotting those signs. I think that one of the most important things to realize, one of the biggest things that I realized, was that because we're all different anyway, right? We all have different personalities and characteristics and stuff like that. We're all special snowflakes, aren't we? So the thing is that what will be a sign for one person being overwhelmed and having too much stress, and I think that the key thing is that we need to understand is about that kind of, it's not about having any stress, because we don't want no stress anyway, but it's about that point where the stress becomes too much. There is an optimal level of stress, which I'm sure we'll come on to at some point. But if we're under too much stress, it's understanding the changes that have happened. So the changes in our behavior, the changes in how we feel physically, changes in how we feel emotionally. For some people, they may withdraw, for example, emotionally and behaviorally, they're kind of withdrawing from social situations. Other people, they may become more gregarious and more sociable because they use it as a distraction technique from that overwhelm. So it's not so much that one or the other is the case. It's that if it's a change from what's normal, then perhaps there's something going on. In the same way as a new symptom physically could be the sign of an onset of a physical illness, whereas that symptom might be something that someone else lives with all the time and it's not a symptom of the same illness, right? So it's understanding that very personal nature of it. And has something changed? Are you behaving differently to how you normally would? Are you feeling different to how you normally would? Are other people noticing things in you that perhaps they weren't noticing before? None of these things are cut and dried as signs that you're under too much stress or that you're becoming overwhelmed. Some of them might be signs that there is something physical going on. And, I would implore anyone to go and get checked out physically as well, to rule out, if nothing else, to rule out physical stuff. Because some of the physical signs of stress, fatigue, headaches, brain fog and lack of concentration, confusion, forgetfulness, physical aches in the body. There's all kinds of stuff that is linked to that overwhelm and that stress. But those are very generic symptoms, which could be of so many different things. So it's not massively helpful. And I apologize that I don't have a clear answer. If only life was that simple. Go and get yourself checked out, have some blood tests, make sure there's nothing kind of insidious lurking under the surface that needs to be dealt with physically. And then if there isn't, if the blood tests are coming back like normal and the scans are coming back normal, then address the fact that maybe that's being caused by something that's lifestyle related, that's work related or personal life. And then you can kind of think, right, what's going on? What's changed? What is happening in my life at the moment?
Yeah.
And you can assess it in that way.
I think that is actually a very clear answer, as much as I know you're saying it's no one size fits all, and absolutely right, and we need to go and actually check, right? That's reasonable for everybody listening. But I think the clear answer there is being self-aware enough to know the changes that you're experiencing, because being stressed isn't always putting your fist for a wall. It's not always because like you've got too much work on your plate. There's so many different ways it can reveal itself. But like you've said, if you can have the awareness to see the changes, you can start to notice patterns as well. And patterns is something that I find really, really interesting when it comes to stress, because that can sometimes be the difference between going on these kind of extremes of like, intense stress, or stress turning to chronic stress, basically, and then leading to burnout. One of the things that you share with me, Joe, before we obviously hit record today, was you've obviously been experiencing fibromyalgia as a chronic stress-related illness, and this is something you've obviously had to live with for a very long time. And it's something that you said you've had a bit of a flare up recently on. So I'm curious to know from your experience, like what are some of the changes that you notice within yourself when you start to perhaps notice these flare ups?
Yeah, the fibromyalgia thing is an interesting one because it's almost forced my hand into becoming more self-aware than perhaps I was in the past. And it is something I've lived with for a long time, but it's something I've only had a diagnosis of for a few years. So I've lived with it for a long time before knowing what it was, which is incredibly frustrating. It's still frustrating now because it's a very misunderstood, or very poorly understood, I should say, condition. So the causes of it are very unclear. It's suggested that it's neurological, and it's often triggered by a period of intense stress, and that can be physical or mental stress or trauma. For me, the suggestion is that started as a result of having had cancer, so physical stress on the body, and that can often trigger these kinds of conditions. It can also trigger things like autoimmune conditions and things like that, which fibromyalgia isn't considered to be autoimmune, but there are similarities. And what I've noticed is that the more flare-ups I have, the earlier and earlier I catch them from experience. You start seeing these signs, you start seeing these patterns like you described it, and you catch them earlier and earlier because just through experience. It's through trial and error more than anything else. And I think that's an important lesson for anyone, whether they live with a condition like this or not, is that through just sheer experience of these things, you can take those lessons if we are willing to kind of look at them in a bit more detail, not usually in the moment as well, but after the fact, and go, okay, what happened just before? What was happening just before this happened? And when we assess those things, communication is for me the fundamental foundation of almost everything, right? Communication socially, and self-awareness really is just communication with yourself. That's what self-awareness is. And so it becomes that kind of foundational point again, where you're having a discussion with yourself going, right, what can we see happening here? Sometimes it's very beneficial to have that conversation with other people who are close to you. What did you notice just before I XYZ?
Yeah.
And for me, some of the signs are, I mean, fatigue is a big one. Fatigue is one of the main symptoms of fibromyalgia. It's very similar to chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, but it has the added bonus of widespread chronic pain as well, just as an extra cheeky addition to the fatigue. It's all fun and games, right? So I notice fatigue. I also notice pain, physical pain. If I'm under I'm under a lot of pressure, or something has happened that's raised my kind of emotional state in some way, and it can be sadness, anger on that side of things, or it could be something that's often considered a positive emotion. I don't like labeling emotions as positive or negative personally, but what's widely considered to be positive emotions, if I'm ecstatic about something, that can trigger these same kind of physical responses, because it's an intense emotional change. So I'll notice fatigue, I'll notice widespread pain, I'll notice headaches, lack of concentration. Lack of concentration is one of the first things I notice. If I can't concentrate on things which I normally find really easy to concentrate on. I'm not great at concentration at the best of times, but some things I get really hyper focused on. And if I can't do that, or I don't do that, and I'm just like, I can't get stuck in, I think, hang on a minute, I know what's happening here. And I know that if I continue to push through, this is only going to get worse. So I kind of wind things back. I clear my calendar a little bit. I remove things which I don't have to do. I'm very into my background of being a personal trainer and stuff. I like training. I can't train super hard because of my condition, but I like to train regularly. And that's one of the things where I have to go, I'm going to have to knock that on the head for a couple of weeks, because that's a physical stress on the body that I can't cope with at the moment. And sometimes I even have to start from scratch, from I lose months and months of strength, and I have to start from scratch again, which is incredibly frustrating. But I know that if I don't do that, I will end up going through, I'm not willing to go through a third burnout, right? I did it once. Wasn't sure if I liked it. Did it a second time just to be sure. That's it for me. I am not doing it a third time, and so I have to be willing to make sacrifices.
That's so interesting that you said that. It's like, because the whole burnout, I can relate to that. I burn out not once, not twice, 3 times. But they've all presented very differently each time. So I'm curious to know, from your burnouts, was it exactly the same kind of pattern that kind of led you where you ended up, or was that was the experience different, I guess?
I think the details were different, but I think the process was very similar. I think that the process was very much one of overwork and overcommitment. It was the need, or the perceived need, to do better all the time, and to do more, and to improve. Now, I'm a big fan of consistent improvement, right? I like the whole kind of Japanese concept of Kaizen. I've got a tattoo of it on my forearm to remind me of it.
A tattoo here.
Oh, have you?
I wasn't wearing this now, yeah.
I've got one on my forearm there. But it's to remind me that consistent improvement is a good thing. But I think that we are missold what consistent and constant improvement looks like. It doesn't have to be, improvement doesn't necessarily mean more. It can sometimes mean less.
Usually does.
In fact, it can often mean less. And it's that, I can never pronounce his name. It's the author who wrote The Little Prince. There's a quote from him, Antoine something or other. He's a French author. And he had a quote which was, perfection is not when nothing more can be added, but when nothing more can be taken away. I paraphrase. I've probably absolutely butchered that quote. But the idea is that perfection is about removing the fluff, removing stuff that doesn't need to be there. And so, yes, I am still a recovering perfectionist. And in fact, one of my values now is imperfection. I've realized that in the middle of a talk I was delivering once. I realized I was talking about values, and I was like, I've just realized that imperfection is one of my values, because I'm very much about openness and honesty. None of us are perfect. And so therefore, imperfection and showing up imperfectly is actually really important to me. But I am a recovering perfectionist, and I still have that in my mind. And there's a lot of stuff that happened when I was a child, which kind of led me down that path of striving for perfection. Probably a story for another day. But the reframing of what perfection actually is has helped me understand that consistently trying to do more isn't necessarily where I need to be. But that was the pattern which led me to both of the burnouts, because when I was a teacher, I could always be planning a better lesson. Like that's the marking is the marking, the planning. There's always something you could do better. There's always more work to be done when you're a teacher. There is no, oh, I've done everything, I'm fully caught up. That just doesn't happen. And the same thing happened when I was a personal trainer, because when you own a business, once again, there is always more that you could do. There is no, oh, I'm fully caught up as an entrepreneur, right? And it's actually true of many industries and many positions in many industries, that you could be working in any company in the world and there's probably always something more that you could do. But doing more doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it better. In fact, often you end up spreading yourself more thinly. And when you're more tired and your focus is going and you kind of can't think straight, your work quality suffers. So is it not better? Is it not about consistent improvement to actually scale things back and realize that you can get 80% of the results by doing 20% of the effort? And you can do it so much better when you do it that way. So the process, the pattern was that need to prove myself, that need to do more, that need to excel. And that's what led me to not being able to do anything. And I was no good as, not only, did I lose a business, and not only had I already lost my initial career, but I also was no good as a dad. I was no good as a husband. I was no good as a friend. I could barely get out of bed. And so who was I benefiting? Who was I helping by putting myself through that? We all make mistakes, and we've all been there, and we all go through these things, and we all make poor decisions. And it's not until after the fact that we know that it was a poor decision necessarily. So I'm not being judgmental here. I've been through it and I still make terrible decisions now. But when we reframe that, when we can see that that pattern is occurring in us, we can work on our own values around perfection. We can reframe our understanding of stress, and we can start doing things which allow us to constantly and consistently improve and get better in a different way than perhaps we considered in the past.
Yeah. Everything you've said there, I'm sure everybody listening can resonate with. Same with myself. I really like the reframe of being imperfect, and you kind of hear the cliche, we're all imperfectly perfect, and that's okay. And but to really feel that, and for you to have it as a core value, is quite interesting, considering the pattern of burnout that you've experienced and like your tendency. I think I'm going to try and adopt that as an intention. It's like my intention is actually to be imperfect. I think that could be really beneficial. So I'll give that one.
I think with that as well, it releases some paralysis around doing things, because we can be very quick to keep things to ourselves if we don't think they're good enough. And actually, whether this is in business, whether it's in work, whether it's in our personal life, we can go, well, I don't want to do that because I don't want to put something out there that people will judge or people will think isn't good enough, when really actually we're the only person who's judging it that harshly anyway. And we would get much better result if we just put it out there and did the thing. And that could be, putting a proposal in. It could be getting up and delivering a short talk. It could be doing something romantic for your partner. It could be, all of these things, they're better done than perfect. And again, it's a cliche, isn't it? But it's true. And I think that when we adopt that as an intention or a value or whatever, it releases us from that paralysis, and it actually allows us to see a greater level of progress as a result.
Absolutely. The Pareto principle as well that you mentioned, of like 20%. Yielding 80% of your results, that really stuck with me. I can't remember, it was years ago that I first really learned about that and understood it, and it was probably only the last few years that I really adopted it, and really was like, okay, this is something that I'm embodying now. And even though when I still get overwhelmed, I have to bring myself back to that idea. And like you said about scaling back your calendar or commitments or certain things to the essentials, right? I was like, okay, what's 20% of a work day? And I was like, okay, we're looking at about 3 hours. That's not necessarily a work day, we're like a 12-hour day. I'm like, okay, if I can just do 3 hours of deep focused work in one day, that's more than enough. And I'm very I'm very grateful that I can have that choice. But a lot of people can't when it comes to a work setting. And I know you do a lot within companies. And somebody in particular came to mind when you were speaking about your pattern and feeling like you can't necessarily concentrate on certain things, but yet there are these demands. There's somebody that I was speaking to very recently that was experiencing that, but yet she didn't feel like she could speak to her line manager. There was different things happening within her company, which meant her line manager had actually kind of moved and somebody else was in play now. They hadn't built up that trust, if you like. But she was also, regardless of the lack of trust that had been built in relationship to open up to her about what she was experiencing, she also had this deep, intense fear that she would be penalized for sharing that in the workplace, which then added even more paralysis to what she was already experiencing. I would love to know your insights on that, because I know she'll be listening to this.
Well, first off, that is a challenging situation to be in, and I think it's actually quite a common situation to be in my experience as well. I think there'll be a lot of people listening to this who either are experiencing that right now, or who have experienced it, or who can imagine experiencing it in the near future. I would say it's very close to 100%. And there's no easy answer to this. I think that it highlights the importance of having leaders, both senior leaders and middle management and people leaders of any size team, whether it's 3 people or 3,000 people, who understand stress and understand overwhelm and are willing to open up and talk about it. Because if people don't, that's when you lose people, either to burnout or to just staff churn. They go somewhere else where they feel more valued and more able to be themselves. So you do lose people, and there is a huge financial cost to this. And there's a lot of companies are very much trying to balance, well-being on one side, but finances on the other. It's like, hey, look, this is a win-win or a lose-lose. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not a trade-off between money and people. In which case, if it was, I mean, maybe I'm an idealist, but people should win out over money, right? But it's not even the case. It's either you look after your people and you help them manage their stress effectively, so that not only are they do they have a better quality of life, because that's what well-being is, right? It's your quality of life, but they also perform to a higher standard. And how does that not benefit the company? The revenue and the profit in an organization is driven by the people, and so it makes no sense to me not to look after the people from any angle that you look at this.
I'm with you on that. Preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, I know. Like, I know, but I'm like,
we need
and it's improving, right? There's more and more organizations are understanding that very basic concept now, and it's fantastic to see. But I do think there's still a fair way to go. Now, going back to that individual situation, because what I've just shared there was very much a kind of a long-term, where can we end up and how can we get there? And it's, through training and strategy, leadership development, and so on and so forth, which is what I've kind of dedicate my time to doing more than anything else. But for an individual who's in that situation, is like, well, that's all well and good, Jay, but that's not where I'm at.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that we need to remember is that we don't have to, that fear of being reprimanded for opening up about something, or for putting boundaries in place. I think that we see it as a very binary thing: either shut up and put up, or kick up a fuss. And people don't want to kick up a fuss because they don't want to deal with the fallout from that. Totally understand that, completely get it. That is a valid fear, because people do get reprimanded for that stuff, whether they should or shouldn't. It happens. Their careers can be affected. But it's not a binary choice. It's a spectrum. It's not a put up and shut up or kick up a fuss. There's a million shades between that. And depending on who you're speaking to, depending on who your manager is, depending on whether it's your manager you speak to, or someone else within the organization, or someone outside of the organization, there's so many options. You are not just picking on or off. And I think that what can be really useful is to sit down and think about what those options are. What is available? What do I need, first of all? What is the problem? And then secondly, what are some of the ways that I can start to reduce that problem? It's not about going, this is where my stress levels are, and I want them to be right down here. They're right up here, and I want them right down here. They're right up here. How can I bring them down by a couple of percent? That's all you need to do to start with. And then when you've done that, you can do it again. And it's incremental. It's iterative. So if you look at that, you can go, okay, well, where can I put a boundary in place that isn't going to rock the boat so much that I cause myself more stress? because that's the worry, right? You're gonna shoot yourself in the foot by causing more stress whilst trying to reduce the stress. And you're just like, well, what's the point?
Yeah.
So what can you do that will reduce it, but it's not going to cause huge problems? And putting boundaries in place is one way you can do that. That could be around your hours. It could be around where you're working. It could be to do with personal stuff, right? We've only got a single capacity to deal with stress. We don't have a work capacity and a personal capacity. We have one capacity, which is why when someone is going through bereavement, for example, it affects their work. And we need, as leaders, to be aware of that and to know how to support people with bereavement, because it's not a separate stress container that's going into. So it could be that you look at, right, well, this is all going on at work. I don't know who to speak to. What can I do, even temporarily in my personal life, to turn down or turn off some of those taps which are flowing stress into my stress bucket? How can I turn down the flow a little bit to give myself a bit of breathing room? What is within your control? Some things are outside your control. Some things are, you can influence them, and other things are well within your control. And being able to differentiate between those things is part of that awareness and part of that realization that actually, you know what, I can't control the world at large, but I can control this. And that's enough for now. Yeah. One note that I would really like to highlight on the subject of boundaries is one of the fears that people have often shared with me around setting more strong boundaries, and when I say strong, I don't mean rigid, I mean strong and flexible, is the fear that other people will hate them for it, essentially, and just go, how dare they? Who do they think they are?
Yeah.
And what I try to remind people is that nobody meets someone with good boundaries and thinks less of them as a result.
Yeah.
Like, most of the time when you meet someone who's got good boundaries, you admire them and you go, wow, I wish I could do that.
Yeah.
I wish I had boundaries like that. They really kind of back themselves, and that's brilliant. And so by putting good boundaries in place, not unreasonable boundaries, but good, strong boundaries, you may actually find that you do your career some good, rather than being considered a walkover, who is just is too scared to say no. Is being a yes person going to get you ahead? Maybe in some instances, but not always. I think that having boundaries, we need to remember, is actually something that most people respect. And if we take ourselves out of the picture and we're less judgmental of ourselves, and we see it as if someone else did this, what would I think? Well, I would think fair play to them. That's probably what other people are going to think about you.
Exactly. And if you're a yes person and you're just saying yes, but you're compromising yourself whilst you're saying yes, you're already almost like moving against your nature to some extent, or at least there's some time there to do a bit of a self-audit and understand, well, why are you saying yes? Because otherwise you end up so far down the road. The amount of times I've spoken to clients who have found themselves almost like at the top of the chain of like wherever it is they're working, and realized that actually that's not what they really wanted. They just sort of ended up there. I think there's the analogy is like climbing and putting your ladder up against the wrong wall when you can finally get to the top, right? And it's not quite what you expected. And it's that happens with these little decisions, right, that feel like massive decisions maybe at the time, but because we're so close to them, they can become much bigger than what they need to. So I really love what you said there about just expanding that perspective and looking at, okay, what are all the options that are in front of me right now that perhaps could actually be almost like the low-hanging fruit, the easy win that I can plug into. We had another guest on the podcast called Jason, who spoke about releasing the grip by like 5%. And the minute we just like that thing that we're holding on to, that tension, that stress in the body, as soon as we just release that just a little bit, we end up creating a bit more capacity to actually be able to then receive what we actually need, right? Or to at least give ourselves what we need. And I love the fact that you mentioned boundaries. Boundaries is a biggie, an absolute.
I saw a post on Threads the other day, the brand new hangout, which said something about it was just something which randomly came up, not someone I followed, which said, I'm sick of seeing the word boundaries on social media, and I just replied to it going, you'll hate me then. It's just like, I love talking about boundaries. But I think that I just wanted to kind of touch on what you said there about that releasing the grip, and that kind of that idea of small percentages and small things that you can do. I have this kind of, one of my core principles of what I talk about is something called minimum effective dose, and it was used originally, it's a pharmacology term to do with drug development, because you want to understand what the minimum effective dose is, i.e. what is the smallest amount of this medication that gets the desired effect. The absolute smallest amount, because if it's the smallest amount that gets the desired effect, there's less risk of side effects and so on and so forth, right? And also less risk of wasted money and less risk of just wastage in general. So it makes a lot of sense in drug development. Sometimes you come across it in the fitness industry as well, where it's like, what's the minimum I can do to get the result I want, which reduces the risk of things like injury and stuff like that. And it's a process that I subscribe to. You know, I don't want to be a Olympic athlete or a bodybuilder or anything like that. So what do I actually need to do in order to get the results I want? Well, the result I want is to be kind of physically fit enough and strong enough and flexible enough to do things that I enjoy doing. And what's the minimum amount of training that I need to do that, which reduces the risk of me ending up with a fibromyalgia flare-up or becoming injured from a joint or muscular perspective. And I use it with stress management as well. It's right, well, what's the minimum that you need to do in order to reduce the level in your stress bucket as it's approaching the top? And when that bucket overflows, that's your burnout. We want to keep it away from the top. What's the minimum you can do? And there's two ways of doing that, obviously. Turn some of the taps off or down, like we said, but also let some of that water out through kind of pressure relief, that self-care, that kind of the things which allow you to let go of some of the stress you've already taken on. Those are the only two things we can do: reduce what's coming in, increase what's going out. But what, there's an obsession with massive action and trying to, right, I'm going to turn off all the taps and I'm going to let all of the water out and I'm going to go on a 2-week retreat in Central America. And
that's why I was
yeah, exactly. That's where my head was going with it. And it's like, great, brilliant. They serve a great purpose. And yes, they can remove a huge amount of stress. But when you come back, what's changed? Have you changed anything on a micro level? So it's usually over a longer period of time. If we're looking at, right, where do I want to be in 6 months' time, a year's time, 2 years' time, 5 years' time, whatever, I want longevity in terms of my management of stress, then looking at the smaller stuff is much more effective, looking at that minimum effective dose, because then you can go, right, I'm just going to turn this tap down by a tiny bit. I can't turn my workload off. That's not going to happen, right? That would just cause other stresses like having no money. So turn that down a little bit and then go from there. Or let a little bit out, turn on one valve by doing some breathing exercises, like at one point during the day, every day, or getting out for a walk for 5 minutes before you start your work day, like tiny stuff. Write down, like, you start keeping a journal of good things that have happened that day. Write down 3 good things that have happened that day every evening. Just tiny things that you could do every day. And that's that minimum effective dose. The small things which you can do. And let's be honest, I'm sure there's plenty of people listening to this who are incredibly busy people, and adding huge changes that they need to make in order to deal with their stress is actually going to add more stress, because you say, yeah, you need to do this, you need to meditate, and you need to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do an hour of breathing exercises and yoga. And it's like, people don't have time for this stuff. People have got careers and children and all kinds of stuff going on. Don't add more stress. That defeats the point. Do tiny things. And that's, the minimum effective dose principle is something which really ties in with what you were saying just then.
Yeah, and it's so important for longevity. So one of the things we always talk about here is about creating lasting change. That's what we care about. We spent too long in the fitness industry seeing people coming in, short-term goals because they've got a wedding or whatever that they want to get in shape for. They do that and then they go back and they gain all the weight or whatever. Again, when they come back and they're back to square one, a bit like what you said there as well, is like people will go away and do like a retreat or whatever, come back, experience the same thing. So it's like, how do we create that sense of lasting change? And it is exactly that. It is that minimum viable dose. It is, what do you need right now? Immediately, what do you need right now? And we give that there are so many, and everybody can see on social media, there's so many different avenues and different things you can do to help to stress, which is great. That's one of the good things about social media, is you can learn and be exposed to things that maybe you've never thought of before.
Yes.
But that pressure, like you said, to do it all and to do it all to the same intensity and to the same amount of time and everything with everybody else, it can become quite toxic. So again, that's where the boundaries piece of what you were talking about earlier kind of comes into play as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and the self-awareness piece that we started talking about at the start, and understanding that what works for one person isn't going to work for another. In the same way, I bought into the 5 a.m. club thing for a while. It's like, yeah, you get up earlier and you get a head start on the day and you get extra time. It's like, do you get extra time because you're going to bed an hour earlier or 2 hours earlier in order to cope with getting up 2 hours earlier? So it's like, does it really work? Doesn't work for me. Did it for a little while. 7 a.m. is perfect for me. I'm happy with it. In fact, 6:45, that's perfect for me. And I have no inclination to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning unless I've got a flight to catch, right, or something else along those lines. And yet this almost cultish behavior starts happening around certain things. It's like the perfect morning routine. There is no perfect morning routine. I very nearly swore then because I'm so passionate about it. Just like, there really isn't. There is only a perfect morning routine for you now, for you. Because yes, it's going to be different for each person. Your perfect morning routine is going to be different from mine, but also my perfect morning routine this week is going to be different to what it was 2 years ago, and it will be different again probably in 6 months' time. And so the self-awareness and the adaptability, we're very adaptable creatures, humans. We have to understand that as a species, our adaptability has, for better or worse, made us the dominant species on the planet, right? We can argue forever over whether that's actually a good thing or not, but it has happened. And the reason it's happened is because of our ability to adapt to changing environments and circumstances. And if we remember that we as individual humans have that adaptability too, or we as organizations and companies, a company is just a group of people, you know, you say we've got company, it just means you've got a group of people, right? And groups of people are adaptable. And if we remember that at an individual level, that we have that adaptability of the human species, we can adapt to these crazy changes that happen around us and learn from them, rather than being like, oh my God, this has changed and I'm scared. I had a really good point to make as well, and I've completely forgotten what it was. Oh no, I remembered what it was. About personal things. This is the way my brain works. Go off on a tangent. An example of personal preference around stress and stress management is, are you a shower or a bath person, right? So some people love to have a bath to relax. I find baths stressful, like properly stressful. I hate them. I will, and people are like, how can you find a bath stressful? Well, I'll tell you how. I make it too hot every single time without fail. I always forget, every now and again, I'll forget that I don't like baths, and I'll be like, oh, I'll have a bath. And I'll make it too hot, and I go red in the face, and I get out sweatier than I got in, and I'm just like, I should have had a shower. Showers I find really relaxing. And so that's my personal preference. And another example, I'm wearing my heavy metal therapy t-shirt, which is a CIC, who deal with mental health conditions and support through the means of heavy metal and other heavy music. My personal music taste is very stressful for a lot of people, including my wife. She cannot stand the music I listen to, and it makes her it raises her stress level. For me, it reduces my stress level. And so we need to understand that our personal self-care toolkit, our stress management toolkit, is going to be very different from the people around us, and that's okay. Yes, we can take inspiration from each other. As you said, sharing ideas is profound. And I think that social media, as you said, is really good for that. But I think that if we have these conversations in the workplace, someone goes, oh, this is what I do. I go, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. That's going on my list as well. We can share those ideas. And I think that open conversations in the workplace are so powerful in that regard. But there will still be differences. And understanding those differences and celebrating those differences and knowing what works for you in different circumstances is so huge when it comes to managing stress.
Yeah, 100%. There's also an element of shame that plays a part as well when somebody can't stick to something. Like you mentioned, 5 a.m. Club. Like, I know so many people around that time when Robin Sharma published his book, and we've been talking about it for years, but around the book, there was this heightened buzz again all about it. And there were people that were really giving themselves a hard time because they couldn't do it, or they did do it and they hated themselves for doing it. And it was like, oh, put the brakes on. Why are you even doing it in the first place? Like, what?
I'm like that with meditation. Like I can't meditate in the traditional sense. And people are like, oh, well, you just haven't found that. And I'm like, no, I've tried lots of different styles. Why do you feel the need to make it suitable for everyone? Why can't you just accept I don't like meditating? Oh, but it has all these benefits. Yeah, so does a lot of stuff.
From heavy metal, probably get the same benefits.
Exactly, right? For me, the benefits of meditation I get elsewhere. And that's okay. It's like not liking a food, right? It's like, oh, but this food, this particular ingredient has all of these nutrients. I'm like, yeah, but I bet it's not the only source of that nutrient. You can get it elsewhere, right? And so for me, it's like that with meditation. I'm like, do you know what? That release and that kind of mindfulness I get from doing stuff like surfing or listening to music. Mosh pits are a great example of mindfulness. I like to call things like surfing and mosh pits and stuff like that extreme mindfulness, because if you're not fully present in the moment, if you're worrying about how many emails you've got to reply to, someone's going to flatten you. You need to be 100% there, present in the moment. And so that's what works for me, right? I've figured it out.
That's probably the first time on this podcast in like 100 and something episodes where somebody has actually said, you know, getting in a mosh pit is actually like a good way of managing stress. I love it. It's so true.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I mean about thinking outside the box and finding what works for you as an individual. Some people, again, worst idea. It is not going to be a stress reliever for you.
That will.
So I'm not going to sit here and say everyone should do it, because that's categorically just false. But for some people, it's perfect.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's that the guilt and the shame and that kind of, oh, everyone else can do it, why can't I do it? I can tell you this, if you're feeling like that right now, if you're watching this, listening to this, and you're thinking there's this one thing which everyone does that I can't do and I feel rubbish as a result, I can tell you everyone isn't doing it. Just the people who are doing it are really vocal about it. Right? That's all. That it seems like everyone's doing it because it's a trend.
Yep.
But the majority of people in the world probably aren't doing it. They're just going about their lives, not worrying about doing your ice bath every morning.
Exactly. It's funny, I was thinking ice baths when you said that.
Yeah, that's the current one, right? Isn't it? And I used to do cold showers. I tried it and I loved it at the time.
Yeah.
And then it stopped working for me, and it started causing more problems than it solved. Again, to do with things like fibromyalgia. I have, sensitivity to temperature changes and stuff like that. So I was just like, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to go back to having hot showers. And people are, oh, but it's got so many benefits. And it's like, yeah, but like it's only if it works for you, right? There's this personal thing. And it's like, I know it's a big thing at the moment. And I know that there's evidence for certain benefits and things like that, but it's like it's only going to be beneficial if you do it consistently, and it's something that suits you, so it suits your physiology, suits your psychology. We're all special snowflakes, I'll say it again.
And there's always like other ways to get the same benefits, like you said as well. It's funny, so Jonathan, my husband, and I, Jonathan loves an ice bath every morning without fail. He'll be having an ice bath if he can, whereas I'm very, very adaptable. I realized, I wish I'd realized it earlier, but I realized I am definitely somebody that needed to accept my ability to adapt rather than try and be rigid and try and do the same routines and this kind of stuff. That was a source of stress for me, for sure. And it was a case of like, okay, now, like I can do a ice bath every day, and then I won't do it for a month, and then I'll do it again every day for a bit. But that's because I choose to, and I'm aware of why I'm doing it, or I'll do it every 2 days or something like that, because I'm listening to what my body actually needs. And the minute
a bit like what I do with my workouts.
There you go. Yeah.
I just have to go, is this suitable for me right now, or has something changed?
Exactly. And the minute you actually start to move with what you need, and you start to actually embody what you need, and you're okay and at ease with changing things within yourself, that's, I think, where that kind of the game changes, and you start to really own who you are. For me, I have, and I've been doing this for a long time now, I have essentially like 10 things that are become non-negotiable or rituals for me every single day. Do I always hit them every day? No. But that's what I aim towards, and I review them every single week, and I look at, okay, what needs to be these 10 things for this week ahead, and I'll aim in that direction. And when I'm aiming in that direction, I'm consistently improving. But in a way that makes sense for me. And sometimes on that list is rest. Be non-striving. And for me, that actually almost gives me permission for that week to lean into that a little bit more. And I found that really, really useful. And it's definitely helped me grow my capacity to be able to handle more and more when it comes to kind of demands of life. I think that it's made a real, real difference. I just want to pick your brains on something, Jay. I'm conscious of the time here with you, but when we here at Wellness Theory are talking about stress, we talk about stress showing up in 3 different ways. We see like day-to-day stress, we see stress and how it's showing up in the body, and we see stress that comes from kind of deep within ourselves, within our beliefs, within our unresolved emotions, within like our values, and if that's in conflict, and many other kind of different areas in those 3 segments. They're all one and the same. Stress is still stress, but it gives sometimes people a way to look at stress. But I'm really curious to pick your brains on kind of that root side of things. Like, how much do you feel stress is heavily linked to more of our psyche and our life experience in comparison to like the day-to-day stuff that you might see when you're working with individuals or groups or teams in an office kind of situation?
I think I love that question, by the way. That's got me thinking. I like that. The kind of the framework, or I guess the filter through which I see it, is more of a two-sided thing than a triangle. Although, again, I'm always adapting this as I learn and as I grow and as I experience different things and talk to different people. And I've kind of termed this internal and external stress, and I've termed it physiological and psychological stress. And there's different ways that you can kind of look at it. Another way of thinking about it is sensory stress versus perceptive stress. So let me explain what I mean by this. And I'll use the analogy of any kind of sensory organ. I'm going to use the eye as an example, right? So the process of sight in a human is our primary sense. Really fascinating to kind of look into in depth if you're a massive nerd like me. But the eye has the role of sensation, which is taking an external stimulus and turning it into a nervous impulse, an electrical impulse in the nervous system, right? That's literally all it does. That's what the eye does. It takes a particular wavelength of light and it turns it into an electrical signal in the optic nerve. Then the second process is perception, where your brain and the kind of optic centers in the brain will take the nervous signal from that nerve and they will interpret it. So sensation is just external stimulus to electrical impulse. And then the perception is, what does that electrical impulse mean? Which is why two people can look at the exact same thing and see something completely different. Okay, so hopefully that's a brief explanation of the difference between sensation and perception. One is physical, one is psychological. Yeah, physical sensation, where you change one thing into another, and then psychological perception. Our psychological perception is at the mercy of our entire life of conditioning.
Yeah.
So we have all kinds of filters which that is processed by.
Yeah.
Now, if you take that in the context of stress, an external stressor, so a stressor being a source of stress, two people can go through the exact same external stressor and have a completely different perception of that. That perception is the second layer of stress. It's the psychological stress. And that comes from the conditioning. So like, as you said, values and beliefs and so on. Where do those values and beliefs come from? We are conditioned with them. They happen through experience. They're not preloaded. Yes, we come with the hardware, but the beliefs and the programming comes from experience. And you can see this through lots of psychological studies done on twins, for example, who've been separated at birth, exactly the same genetically, exactly the same hardware, completely different operating systems installed on them throughout their life. So when we look at it in terms of stress, the day-to-day, when you talk about day-to-day stress, that's the kind of, what's happening to us. And you could have two people working in the exact same role in the exact same company, going through pretty much the exact same stress. They're not necessarily going to be exactly the same, because there are going to be people are going to speak to them slightly differently, or there's various different subtle nuances going on. But let's just say, for argument's sake, it's exactly the same. Their perception of what's happening is going to be different. One person might be able to deal with that external stress more effectively as a result of the conditioning that they've been fed. They might have had a very supportive upbringing. They might have been encouraged to make mistakes and learn from them. They might have felt emotionally secure. They had really good attachment with their parents and all of this stuff. And so they deal with stress more effectively. The other person might have had poor attachment with their parents. They've been through trauma. They've got issues around abandonment. All of this conditioning, which again is absolutely well outside of their control. It's not their fault whatsoever. But they, as a result, have a lower capacity to deal with that stress, or rather they deal with it differently, and it feels more overwhelming more quickly.
Yeah.
And those psychological beliefs around the stress are that kind of second layer. So you've got the external or sensory or physiological stress, and you've got the internal or psychological or perceptive stress, which that is then fed through.
Yeah.
I feel like I may have gone a bit too deep on that one, but that's how I see it.
That makes perfect sense. So a really good example of this that I've actually experienced was being in a team environment. And this is me as a team member, and there were two other employees that were part of that team. Well, one was the manager of the team, and everybody else was kind of the same level. And one of the team members started messing around with the boss, and basically all of our team dealt with it extremely differently. So that what was happening is they were disappearing off, leaving a lot of work for other people to do and things like that. And there was a lot of resentment building. There was a lot of there was just a lot of like drama in and around it. But it was so fascinating to see the way everybody responded differently from that same scenario. There was like one that was clearly experienced some kind of trauma in and around people cheating on partners or whatever. Yep. Another one that felt completely rejected and abandoned by the fact that they weren't showing up. Other people that were taking responsibility to a whole nother level and just taking it in their stride and just like doing all of the work that those two should have been doing. And it was just really fascinating for me to see that, but also the emotional responses that came with it. And some people burnt out and ended up leaving the team. Lots of different things that ended up happening with that team in the end, but ultimately the experience was exactly the same, but it was creating such a toxic environment that it had all of those individuals, including the two that were off doing whatever they were doing, had a layer of self-awareness as to what they were experiencing internally, and then the effect that potentially could be having on the people around them. I think would have been so valuable to take that team to a whole another level. And it was a really good eye-opener for me. Fortunately, this was earlier on kind of in my career, and it was good for me to almost like be exposed to that and to see that and experience that, because I think it's helped me to inform now how much perception plays a part and how much all of that stuff at the root and at the core, at that deep psychological level, plays a part. Because I truly believe that it's not usually the thing that stresses us out, it's the thing about the thing, right? It's not that the fact that your boss is giving you more work to do that's maybe tipping you over the edge. Maybe it's your relationship with the situation and how that's impacting your life that is creating that feeling within you. So sometimes we need to just look a little bit deeper under the surface as to what's going on. I'm really curious to know kind of like your thoughts on that, and if that's something that maybe isn't true for everyone, or do you feel differently?
I think that it's I'm an avid fence sitter, by the way. I love to hang out in the grey areas and the middle ground, so I'm very very slow to make any kind of complete and total observations on something, because there's always exceptions. But I would say that for the vast majority of the time, that does play a very big part. I think that if we look at it if we remember about physiological stress, and if we take kind of something that's a bit more clear cut, like a pathological infection, for example, someone gets someone picks up a virus of some kind. There is a physiological stress response to having that infection. The immune response is part of it, and then the perception of that adds another layer to it. Now, I don't think that necessarily, that perception, by reframing things and adapting the way we see that illness, as that's going to get rid of the illness, right? That's just not going to happen. But it will have an impact on outcomes in terms of how does that illness affect our quality of life. And you see it in patient outcomes for cancer patients, for example, where if you have someone who perceives their illness as being terminal, and it's a waste of time even trying, and this is the end, and they're more likely they have a higher mortality rate essentially than patients who go, I can beat this. Now, there are obviously other factors at play, but there is a lot to say that, you know, you can't wish it away, but you can improve your prognosis in medical situations by framing that in a certain way. It's worth being aware that's how powerful our perception can be. It doesn't work to the point, once again, if someone is listening to this and they're going through that, don't sack off the chemo and go, I'm just going to manifest the cancer to go away. That ain't what I'm saying, right? I'm not big on the law of attraction. However, perception does play a part. because and I believe, maybe I'm biased, but I believe that the mechanism through which that has an effect is stress. We know that physical and psychological stress can cause illnesses, but they can also exacerbate existing illnesses. The stress response, an unbridled stress response in the body that's firing in a chronic way, can cause hypertension and heart attacks and cancer and diabetes and dementia. They're basically through actual well-documented physical processes. And so if we are already going through something of that ilk, and we then go through more psychological stress on top of that through our beliefs around it, we are going to make it worse. And that is not a wishy-washy thing. That is a clearly documented, like, mechanistic process. So I think that the two tie into each other. I don't think it's a case of one is necessarily greater than the other, but I think they feed off each other. I think that if we want to address stress management in the most effective way possible, we need to look at it in two ways. And that is, one, at a systemic level, at the source of the stress, the cause of the stress, which could be workload, lack of communication, poor job roles, managers who don't have any leadership skills, various things like that, interpersonal relationships, unsafe physical working environments and disease and stuff like that. And then we also need to look at individual interventions as well, where the focus has maybe unfairly been on the individual for a long time, and individual coping strategies. And a lot of those coping strategies can be around, cognitive behavioral approaches and stuff, where you are reframing what's happening and changing the narrative and the story you tell yourself around what is happening. We're talking about turning the taps off. If you can't turn the taps off, turn them down. If you can't turn them down, then you need to do something else, because, there has to be a solution somewhere. And some of that is going to be through our processing of what's happening. So I think that, again, there's no simple answer that this is more than this, but I do think there is a complex interplay between the two, and we need to address both sides of it.
100%. We always say the stress isn't one-dimensional. And I think if we think that just by fixing one thing or turning one of those taps off doesn't mean there's another tap going to come on over here, if we still can't deal with the way we're perceiving our life, it's really interesting. It's all interlinked, all of it. And I think one of the mistakes I think we've made just generally, like in society, is we separate things, right? We've spoken about this probably before from a health standpoint on the podcast. If you break your arm, you go to A&E, which is fair enough, right? If you feel like you need something else, you go to this specialist, and then they send you to that specialist, and they don't speak to each other. And we have to realize that we are one system. And the more we can have that self-awareness, like we spoke about at the start, we can start to understand how it interlinks and how it works for ourselves as individuals, so that we can at least set ourselves up in a healthier way, perhaps, to navigate and move around and dig into the demands of life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's necessary that we divide things up to a point, because it's how we need it to make sense of our surroundings, right? We need people who are specialists in certain things, because you can't be a specialist if you want to get really hot on the workings of the heart and the cardiovascular system and stuff like that from a surgical perspective, and you become a cardiologist and you're an expert in the heart. We need those people. We absolutely 100% need those people, and therefore we do need those specialisms to a point. But when it comes to our own bodies, I think it pays to be very much a generalist.
100%, definitely. So Jay, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you think our audience needs to hear that perhaps we haven't mentioned today?
I think they've heard a lot. What I'll do is I'll close it by just recapping one or two things which I think, from all of the stuff we've talked about, which has covered a lot of different stuff, that I think would be useful takeaways to actually implement, right? Because what we want is for people to change stuff. It's all well and good listening to things, but unless you change things, nothing changes. So I think that if I was going to pick, let's say, 3 things to remember, one of them would be to to work out your what works for you. That self-awareness, and go, right, okay, what works for me, and take ideas from other people, but really figure out what works for you. That's the first thing. The second thing is to stay adaptable. I think is another key point, is to be willing to have that flexibility and not set arbitrarily rigid boundaries and rules for yourself, but actually go, hey, I'm a human being, I'm super adaptable, that's how we've evolved, I am going to harness that, and I'm going to stay adaptable. And the third thing I would say, specifically for leaders in particular, and when I say leaders, I mean the term very loosely. I don't mean just CEOs and MDs and people like that. I mean anyone who leads any kind of team. That could be a team of 2 people, it could be a team of 2,000, 20,000. It could also be a leader if you consider yourself a leader in your family, which all of us can be. It could be whether you consider yourself a leader in your community or in your friendship group. So anyone who wants to have a positive impact on those around them, I would say lead with curiosity and compassion, so that you can understand other people more effectively. And you have a double whammy of impact there, is that you make people feel safe enough to discuss these things, and you can learn from that. But the second thing is you immediately reduce stress that other people are going through, because they feel heard. And one of the huge areas that people find causes overwhelm is not feeling heard, not feeling valued, feeling like they're isolated and on their own. So if you are a leader, or you interact with people on a daily basis in any way, come at those interactions with curiosity, the need or the desire to understand, and compassion. And I think that those 3 things will make a huge difference. So understand what's necessary for you, be adaptable, and lead with curiosity and compassion.
Love it. Great summary. Jay, where can our listeners come and follow your work?
The best place to come and follow what I do is on LinkedIn. So you can find me, Jay Unwin, on LinkedIn, or I imagine the link will probably be in the show notes. Or you can go to jayunwin.com, which is just going through a bit of a revamp. So by the time this goes out, that might be a new website. But either way, LinkedIn is updated daily with various things. And the most important thing for me is conversation. So please, if you do come and link up with me on LinkedIn, or follow me, or send a connection request, engage, leave me some comments, send me a message. Let's have a chat. I'd love to hear about your experiences. I'd love to extend my learning. And if there's anything that I can ever give in terms of like some pointers or just the odd bit of advice here and there, I'm always happy to do so. So don't just come and find me on LinkedIn and then lurk. Say hello.
I love it. Don't be a lurker.
Yeah.
Amazing. Jay, thank you so much for your insights today. It's been super valuable. There's so many nuggets in there that obviously our listeners can lean into and pull out and try. And I really appreciate you showing up today and for leaning into the work that you do, because it's really important. The more people that can be showing the spotlight onto stress, and then the benefits of actually being able to regulate ourselves so that we can show up in the world, perhaps in a way that's feeling more authentic, then I think that's really powerful. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and everybody listening, we'll see you next time.